Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Professor Droud, and let me just welcome you to the first introductory lecture in Bio 1314 Anatomy and Physiology 1. So today we're going to just introduce ourselves to the human body. We're going to introduce ourselves to the study of anatomy and physiology. And just stick with me and take good notes. Always feel free to go back and rewatch the video and rewind and yeah. So do all of the great note-taking skills that I know that you are aware of as a good student. And let's take a look at Unit 1, Chapter 1. So I'm going to have the learning objectives uh, right on the slide so you know exactly what learning objective that I'm lecturing on. And the good news is that if you're able to satisfy these learning objectives and you figure everything out, that's all that is going to be asked of you when it comes time for exams. And so I think that's really good. So let's start. So the first learning objective is explain the difference between anatomy and physiology. Well, anatomy, quite simply, is the study of structure. Okay, we're studying the structure of what? Well, the structure of the human body, the structure of a skeleton, the structure of certain things within the human body. So, pretty basic there. Physiology is the study of function. Okay, so we've got anatomy and structure and physiology and function. So, those are two things that you want to start putting together. And I have this quote here, and you'll see this quote in a number of different ways, but the way I like to say it is that form is inherently tied to function. You could say it as simple as form equals function. Okay, and what that means is that if you change the form of something, you will change the function of it. Okay, form is absolutely necessary in order for something to perform its function. All right. Another thing you'll see is that physiology lends meaning to anatomy. And if we replace those words, physiology and anatomy, with the definitions up there, we could say that function lends meaning to structure. Okay? So it's kind of cool, kind of interesting, and kind of, this sort of nebulous view of anatomy and physiology, but it's a good place to start. Anatomy is essentially what makes physiology possible, or again, structure is what makes function possible. So kind of cool, kind of cool. Okay, so how do we study anatomy? Or basically, there are two different types. The first is called macroscopic or gross, and I don't mean gross as in, oh, that's disgusting. I mean large, macroscopic anatomy. Things like studying this heart, okay? We could study the heart. We could study the different vessels, the different chambers within the heart, the different valves within the heart. That would be macroscopic or gross anatomy. Or we could be studying microscopic, or what is called histology, or a histological study. And that is, if you look over here, this is cardiac muscle. You can see different cells and how they line up together, and they're striated, and we'll learn all about this later. But this is the stuff that makes up the heart. This tissue makes up this organ, okay? And so we could either study the entire organ and call that macroscopic anatomy, or we could do microscopic anatomy or histology and study the tissue that makes up that organ, okay? So we can also either study anatomy through regional anatomy, where we would study different regions of the body, maybe the cranial region or the thoracic cavity or the abdominal cavity or the pelvic cavity. Okay, all of these would fall under regional anatomy, or we could study systemic anatomy, where we would study certain body systems: muscular, skeletal, nervous system, circulatory, endocrine. Okay, we're actually going to learn about all of those today. So that would be systemic anatomy. But really, you can't have one without the other. You can certainly focus on certain systems or certain regions, but it's important to note that it all goes together within one human body, okay? So that's anatomy. Now let's talk about physiology. Physiology, like we said, we want to recognize that physiology is the study of function. And so both chemical and physical processes will govern the functions of our body's structures. Things like muscle contraction, digestion, nerve impulses, hormonal actions, formations of urine and feces, and breathing and respiration, right? So all of those things fall under the label of physiology. They are functions that go through our body, allow their processes our body goes through. And it's all to sort of maintain this key word here, which we won't go too far into on this slide, but we will down the line here. But homeostasis. And homeostasis is a process and function that achieve steady internal conditions as the external conditions change around us. You know, the insides of our bodies are pretty well maintained. They're pretty steady and they're pretty stable. Whereas our outside conditions, outside of our body, is very unstable, can change from day to day, from hour to hour, from minute to minute. Okay? So that's homeostasis. We'll talk about more of that in a second. The second learning objective is to understand levels of structural organization. Okay? So the first is the subatomic level. This is below atoms. Okay? And what are atoms? Atoms are the elements. You can have an oxygen atom, you could have a carbon atom, okay, a nitrogen atom, phosphorus. I could go on naming them, but those are the atoms. But subatomic, meaning what are those atoms made up of? They are made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons. So you have protons and neutrons in the nucleus of atoms and electrons that fly around in nebulous clouds. Okay, and so we'll probably talk more about atoms as we go on in this lecture, but those are the first two levels. From atoms, we go on to molecules, which are combinations of multiple atoms. And from there, we will eventually get to things called organelles, which are microscopic structures within cells that carry out specific functions. So you can think of organs, and then you can think of organelles, and they're kind of like the organs of the cells. Think of it that way. And then we'll talk about cells as a next level of structural organization. Cells are the smallest independently functional unit in living organisms. In fact, some living organisms are a single cell. Obviously, eukaryotic organisms like us are not single-celled organisms. We have billions of well-developed and well-differentiated cells, but a cell is the smallest independently functional unit. From there, we go to tissues. Tissues are collections of similar cells that work together to carry out specific functions. Like that cardiac tissue that I showed you that would be working together to produce a heart, or to make the heart and do the heart functions, beating and all of those things, sending blood to different areas of the body. Then you've got the organ that we just talked about, like the heart, which is a collection of several different tissues working together to carry out a specific function. From an organ, you go to an organ system. Perhaps we're talking about the circulatory system. That includes the heart, but also includes other parts of the organs, different veins and arteries and all of these sorts of organs that work together to carry out the specific function of circulation. And then last but not least, certainly is the organism, which is a collection of all organ systems necessary for life that produces an organism that can then live its life. So here's what that looks like. We start with the atom, which makes up a molecule, which eventually makes up a macromolecule, which is molecules stuck together. An organelle, which makes up a cell. Cells make up tissues. Tissues make up organs. Organs make up organ systems. And a bunch of organ systems can make a whole organism. So that's something that you'll need to be able to figure out. And if I gave you all of these, you would have to be able to put them in order from least to greatest in terms of levels of structure, okay? So basically going from atom to whole organism. Okay. The third learning objective, we're going to talk about homeostasis and stress. So that was that word that we brought up. Now we're going to go into it. Processes and functions that achieve a steady internal condition, even if the external conditions change around us. That is homeostasis, a steady internal condition, homeostasis, okay? Internal body temperature, right, stays right around 97 to 99 degrees Fahrenheit. But outside it could be hotter than that, or it could be much colder than that, right? But the processes and functions within our body keep our internal temperature right around that very healthy 97 to 99, okay? Obviously, you know, if things deviate too far each way, that's very bad for us. The internal state of the body is best defined as a dynamic equilibrium or balance change, where there's going to be a certain set point or average value for a given variable. And here I've got degrees Celsius, 37 for body temperature, but that's 97 to 99 Fahrenheit. That's kind of the set average value, right? If you think about, oh, you want to be right around 98.6 when you take your temperature. Well, if you're 99, if you're 97, it's not crazy and it's not unexpected. Those conditions can fluctuate around this point. Now, if they fluctuate too far, like we said, that's when a problem is occurring. So we talked about homeostasis. Let's talk about the opposite of that, and stress. So stress is any disruption of that homeostasis that we so badly want to achieve. You can have things like physical stress, like you have an infection, you've got an injury, you've had a surgery, you have a hemorrhage, you've got some sort of pain. All of these things are physical stress. You could have emotional stress. And that's certainly a real thing. Grief, anxiety, depression, guilt, anything that weighs heavily on your mind, that has a physical effect on you. Your emotions have an effect. And then, of course, if you lose that homeostatic control, it can result in illness, and if it continues on, like I said, it can result in death. And so it's not a trivial matter. Maintaining homeostasis is maintaining life. Okay, the fourth learning objective. Negative feedback systems. Okay, so the fundamental mechanism that will keep a variable close to its set point is negative feedback. Okay, so negative feedback is the process in which the body senses some kind of change, and it activates mechanisms that, get this, negate or reverse it. Okay, right? That makes sense. Negative feedback. It wants to negate a change. So think about like your home heating system. Let's say that you set the temperature at 70 degrees. That's kind of your comfortable point. But during a cold day, the thermostat will end up dropping below 70 degrees. And that turns the furnace on. And so the furnace then heats up the house. And when the temperature rises above 70, the furnace will then turn off. That is a negative feedback process. We've seen something changing, the temperature, and we want to negate that change in temperature, so we turn on the furnace, and once it rises past 70, we'll turn it off. So basically, you'll have the temperature of your house will be fluctuating a little higher, a little lower than 70 the entire day, but it'll average out to about 70 degrees. Because feedback mechanisms alter the original changes that triggered them, they often are called feedback loops, right? And we just talked about the loop. It'll go a little higher than 70, a little lower, but then it'll just loop back and forth. Here's another example of homeostatic control of blood pressure. So when you get out of bed in the morning, gravity will cause all that blood to drain away from your head rather quickly, right? And the lower blood pressure in that region results in an imbalance in the homeostasis of your body. Right? All of a sudden you get pretty lightheaded. This gets detected by things called baroreceptors, which are just sensory nerve endings near the heart. Basically, they check your blood pressure, and they're near your heart. And they will transmit nerve signals to the brainstem where the cardiac control center is. And so they'll say, hey, things are going wrong up near the head. And then the cardiac center responds by transmitting nerve signals to the heart. That speeds the heart up. The heart starts pumping faster, boop, 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 and you can increase the blood pressure to get the blood back to your head. right? That happens, it raises your blood pressure, restores homeostasis. So this is another example of a negative feedback loop. That's three common components of the feedback loop: a receptor, an integrating center, and an effector. The receptor here is a structure that senses the change. What's that? The baroreceptor. The integrating control center is the mechanism that processes the information, makes a decision. That's the let's go back. That is the cardiac center. I couldn't think of the word there. And then the effector is the cell or organ that carries out the final corrective action. That is the heart, right? So very nice. That's a very good example, and one you should definitely write down in your notes. Okay, so we did negative feedback. How about positive feedback and rapid change? I'll tell you that doesn't really happen all that often. Negative feedback is the more classic example, the more common example. Positive feedback happens in one really specific area, not a lot of other areas. It's a self-amplifying cycle in which some sort of physiological change leads to an even greater change in the same direction, right? So something changes and then it regulates it and it moves it faster and faster in one direction. It is a very normal way of producing rapid change. One prime example is giving birth. So once the head of the fetus begins to push against the cervix, it stimulates nerve endings in the cervix. That nerve signal will then travel to the brain, which stimulates something called the pituitary gland to secrete oxytocin. Now, oxytocin then stimulates the uterus to contract, which pushes the fetus downward, and that further stimulates the cervix and causes, well, what we just go back to the beginning. It stimulates the nerve endings, and that stimulates the brain, which stimulates the pituitary gland. You see how this is a positive feedback loop. So this continues on and on. But that using a positive feedback loop in other situations could get dangerous really quickly. The self-amplifying nature can quickly change the internal state of the body to something far away from the homeostatic point, right? Giving birth is really far away from the homeostasis point. Consider having a high fever. And you have an infection and it triggers a fever. Now, a fever is beneficial to a point, right? You raise up your body's temperature, it helps you to fight off this infection. But that temperature rises past 104, and then it starts to cause your metabolic rate to increase, right? Your heart starts to beat a little harder. You start doing more metabolic work. And that means that your body continues to create heat faster and faster than it can get rid of it. Like you start sweating and it's still not getting rid of the heat. And if you raise that temperature past 113, that's when a fever actually becomes fatal. You'll actually learn why when we get to the second chapter, why a fever will become fatal. But this is something that you can see that can really, having a positive feedback, it can get dangerous quickly. Okay, learning objective 6. Given various functions and organs of the body, identify the body systems. And I'll just tell you right now, this is a lot of notes. We're going to run through it quickly here, but feel free to pause at any point, obviously. So the body system that we'll talk about first is integumentary system. You would think of organs of that: the skin, the hair, the nails, the cutaneous glands, things like your nails, right? Those are in cutaneous glands. Those cutaneous glands are found in the skin as well. Functions: to protect you, water retention, thermoregulation, vitamin D synthesis. Okay, I won't go through all of it, but this is just stuff that you should write down. Skeletal, that's pretty easy. Bones, cartilage, ligaments. Functions: support, movement, protective enclosure. Okay, muscular, well, that's skeletal muscles, yeah, movement, stability, communication, body opening control, heat production. Your nervous system: brain, spinal cord, nerves, and ganglia. Things that does: rapid internal communication, right? When you think, I want to reach out and grab that cup of coffee, well, that's going through your nervous system. Endocrine system: things like a pituitary gland, a pineal gland, a thyroid, parathyroid, thymus, all of these things. Testes and ovaries. Well, what do those do? Hormone production, internal chemical communication through those hormones and coordination. Last, cardiovascular, things like your heart and your blood vessels. What does that do? Well, it distributes nutrients, oxygen, waste, hormones, electrolytes all through the blood. Okay, let's continue on and see some of these things. So the integumentary system is your skin, skeletal system is obviously your skeleton, muscular system are all your skeletal muscles. Nervous system, all the nerves, brain, spinal cord, pituitary gland, and the endocrine system is up in your chest area, your pineal gland up in your brain, thyroid gland, parathyroid, thymus, all of these cool things. And the heart and blood vessels makes up your circulatory system. So that's all in your textbook. You can check out that image in more depth. More systems, lymphatic system, got your lymph nodes and lymph vessels. Recovery of excess tissue fluid and detections of pathogens. So lymphatic system is good for fighting disease. Digestive system, this is familiar to everyone. Teeth, tongue, salivary glands, esophagus, stomach, small and large intestines, liver, gallbladder, pancreas. We're pretty familiar with that. Nutrient breakdown and absorption, liver functions, metabolism of carbs, lipids, proteins, vitamins, minerals. You know the deal. Respiratory, your nose, your throat, your pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs. Well, what do we do there? We absorb oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. Also speech. If you couldn't breathe, you couldn't talk. Urinary. Kidneys, ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra. What do we do there? We eliminate waste. We also regulate blood volume and blood pressure. Cool stuff there. And then reproductive systems for male and female. Of course, male has the testes and all the other objects you see there. Reproductive for the female, ovaries, and everything else there. I'll let you read that and copy that down. But the things for the male, production and delivery of sperm, secondary sex characteristics through sex hormones. Same for females except production of eggs, site of fertilization, fetal development, nourishment, birth, lactation, and secretion of sex hormones. Okay, let's look at that. So lymphatic system, we see our lymph nodes, we see a bunch of different vessels. Your respiratory system, you see your chest and your nose and your throat. Urinary system, we see the kidneys, the ureters, and the urethra. The digestive system, we're pretty familiar with. Male reproductive system and female reproductive system. So again, this is in the textbook, right in chapter 1. Really good just to put a picture to these systems. Last, but certainly not least for science course, is to describe the scientific method. It can also be called the inductive method, and basically you're drawing generalizations, you're making predictions based on observations, numerous observations. And so that was the original process. And so the scientific method is now called the hypothetico-deductive method, or let's just call it the scientific method. The first step is to make an observation. You make an observation. I don't know what it is. Let's just say you see a cow pooping and peeing on this tree over here that makes apples. And on the other side of the fence, there's an apple tree, no cows. And your observation is that the pooping and peeing tree makes sweeter apples. And so you make a hypothesis. And a hypothesis at that point is that, well, whatever your hypothesis wants to be. Your hypothesis could be, well, the fertilization process from the poop and the pee from the cow is making that tree grow better and thus produce better fruit. Then you would have to create an experiment where you would have a control group. What's a control group? A control group is where you have what you are experimenting not take place, right? So you don't want to add any poop or pee to the control group. Okay, then you'd have an experimental group, and so you'd have a bunch of trees that did not get poop or pee and a bunch of trees that got poop and pee, right? To see if that's your experiment, that to see if that produces better apples. This is a silly example, but it's the one I thought of off the top of my head. Which group receives the tested variable and which group receives what we call the placebo? Oh, okay. Well, which group receives the tested variable is obviously your experimental group. Which group receives a placebo would probably be your control group, right? If you were doing something, an experiment that required using a placebo, that would be your control group. And what is the double-blind method? Oh, the double-blind method is the ability so that the people that are administering your experiment and the people that are part of the experiment have no idea which group is the experimental group and which group is the control group. In the experiment we talked about, there would be no need for a double-blind method. Lastly, you would make some conclusions based on the data. You would do some mathematics, statistics on those data, and then you would make a report. You'd write a scientific report, which would then have to go through a peer review process. What is it? Well, it's other scientists in your area would check to see if if your experiment was well founded, if it was all done correctly, if you had done enough trials and things of that nature. Why is it important? Well, it's important because you could make up any experiment and just create all sorts of data that's not true at all just to prove your point. And if we just allowed that to be published, well, what would be the difference between good science and fake science? So it's very important to go through a peer review process to make sure that it is good science. And so last I'll talk about a theory. You've probably watched NCIS or some show. I mean, there's so many shows like that. And a guy walks up and he comes up to a murder scene and he's got his dark sunglasses on and he takes them off and he says, "I have a theory." Well, in science, a theory is an explanation derived from facts, laws, and hypotheses that have not yet been disproven. In science, a theory is for a lack of a better term, it is fact, right? The theory of gravity. Now, you can take the bet that if I drop this pencil right here, listen, that it doesn't hit my desk. Well, if you want to bet against that theory, go right ahead. I'll bet my entire life savings against you. Right? We're all pretty familiar with theories in terms of theory of gravity. Science has been unable to disprove them. All the things point to that being the correct answer, and nothing points against it. That's a theory. So a scientific fact is any information that can be independently verified by any trained individual. One example, iron deficiency leads to anemia. Anybody who's trained in what anemia looks like and iron deficiency is could tell you that is true. And then a law, sometimes in biology we don't use the term law as much, but that's more of like a physical science thing, like physics, things of that nature. But a law of nature is a generalization about which ways matter and energy behave. Like one example I could think of is the law of complementary base pairing. You don't know about that yet maybe, but in your DNA there are 4 nucleotides. They've got an A, a T, a G, and a C. A's and T's pair together, G's and C's pair together. That's just how it is. That's the correct way in which it happens. That's a law of nature. Okay? So I'll leave you with this, and you can tell it at the next party and have people tell you you're the most boring person in the world. But you can have a hypothesis about anything. It is just merely an educated guess, basically, a well-informed, educated guess. Right? You can't really have a hypothesis that gravity doesn't exist. There's too much evidence to support the fact that it does. But you can have a hypothesis based on well-informed information about anything. But you cannot have a theory. So the next time somebody says, "I have a theory about that," say, "No, you have a hypothesis." Can you give me an example of a known scientific theory? I threw some out at you. Just think about that as you go on. And I'm going to leave it here. The next lecture will be Unit 1, Chapter 2, and we'll talk about basic chemistry.